Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I'm sure that it will be a more practical and useful and informative conference than the so-called peace conference being assembled just 3 days from now elsewhere in Switzerland. I have a number of points to make here, and they all have to do with telling the truth. Now, that should not be an exceptional thing to do these days, but unfortunately it is. And I would take my little keynote from a Bundesabgeordnete from the German Bundestag, Sevim Dagdelen, who said very perspicaciously, es ist unsere erste Pflicht, sich von diesem Königreich von Lügen nicht dumm machen zu lassen. Okay. For those few who only speak English, it is our first duty by this Königreich, by this kingdom of lies, not to let ourselves be rendered stupid, dumm. Okay. Now, what I have to present here, I put in some slides because we Irish people tend to talk a little bit too much, and I wanted to leave enough time for ample questions and answers. So I will go slide by slide, but I would emphasize before we even start that everything that I say and everything on these slides, unless I say something different, like, oh, this is my speculation, okay, everything on these slides and everything I say is documented and happens to be the truth. Many of you will already know that, but there will be a good proportion of you for whom a lot of this will be brand new news. So with that as a start, let's take a look at that first slide, if we may. Now, most of you know of the promise made by a U.S. Secretary of State, James Baker, back in February of 1990, where the Soviet Union was falling apart. And Baker, at the behest of the President George H.W. Bush, said, look, here's a deal. I'm here to broker a deal here. What we'd really like is a reunified Germany, a reunified Germany. Now, you can imagine the look on the faces of Gorbachev and his foreign minister Shevardnadze. A reunified Germany. Whoa. 27 million Soviet citizens had just died at the hands of a united Germany. My point is simply this was a big quid, right? So they asked, what's the quo here? Quid pro quo, what's the quo? And James Baker, a lawyer from the state of Texas, said, now, how would this be? Suppose we promise to not to move NATO 1 inch east of the German border. How would that be? Well, long story short, the Russians pretty much imploding and expecting a lot of economic help and expecting the promise of George H.W. Bush to be honored, namely a Europe whole and free from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Well, that was not to happen. They bought it, and the promise was violated. Now, after the Berlin Wall, that's what happened. The next thing that we should note in historical perspective is February 1st of 2008. Now, the Russians knew that President Bush and Vice President Cheney were about to cause all kinds of problems on their way out. They only had 1 year left, and so they said, well, let's get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And a lot of Europeans thought that this was very foolish. And a lot of Europeans were quite correct, okay? But as Europeans tend to do, they said, well, okay, if you say so. And even though our ambassador, William Burns, at the time, ambassador to Russia, even he's now head of the CIA, even though he wrote back a stinging cable saying, look, Lavrov, Lavrov, just the foreign minister, even then, just read me the riot act. He said, look, do you know what "niet" means? "Niet" means "niet." If you insist on Ukraine into NATO, we will have to decide whether we have to intervene in Ukraine because there will be a civil war there. We don't want that. So "niet" means "niet," no Ukraine in NATO. How do I know that? It's in a cable from Embassy Moscow to the State Department. How did we get the cable? WikiLeaks. Is it authentic? Everything that WikiLeaks has put out is authentic. So that was February 2008. 3 months later, April, at a NATO summit in Bucharest, the final declaration said the date was April 3rd. Ukraine and Georgia shall become members of NATO. Okay, so that's the background there. Next thing you know, we have a real dust up here in December of 2021. Things are coming to a head. Russian forces are on the Ukrainian border, and we can discuss what comes next. But first, I have a question for you for extra credit. This chart, this slide is woefully incomplete. Now, who can tell me what's missing? What essential matter is missing in this little review of key historic points? That's right. February 2014, there was a coup in Kiev. The coup put in a government friendly to the West. The first thing that government said was, we want to be part of NATO, and we want to ban Russian as an official language. That was the beginning of the end of the Ukrainian fracas, and there's lots more that can be said about that. But I would like to continue in this little historical perspective, reminding you that if you look at these slides later, you need to pencil in February 2014, when the US orchestrated a coup, and I will simply add that it was the most blatant coup in history. Why? Because it was revealed on YouTube. The planning for it was revealed on YouTube 2.5 weeks before the coup itself, with the coup plotters and the designated new leaders of Ukraine revealed. And finally, a message that Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State at the time, conveyed. And she said, well, now Jake Sullivan, now National Security Advisor to Mr. Biden. Then he was Biden's National Security Advisor as Vice President. Nuland saying, Biden's ready to come in. Jake Sullivan just told me that after the coup is over, if we need an international Persönlichkeit, an international figure, Biden will step in and seal the deal. Glue it all together is the way she said it. It's documentary. It's an intercepted message of the likes I've never seen before. If you haven't listened to it, you ought to. Let's not dwell on that. Let's go to the next slide, if we may. May we have the next slide, please?
Yeah, we have a problem here.
Well, while we're getting that slide up, I happen to make a paper copy of these slides, antiquated as I am. And what I want to do is go to December. Can we get that up now, the next slide? Okay. There it is, December 21st of 2021. Now, you'll know, you'll remember, I hope, that Russian forces were assembled on the Ukrainian border, and the Ukrainian forces were hitting Russian-speaking people in the Donbass daily, killing up to 14,000 of them since the coup. So this is really important because nobody seems to focus on it. On December 21st, 2021, Putin was addressing his senior generals and admirals and the secretary and the defense minister, okay? And what he said was, look, America already has missile sites installed in Poland and Romania, and they can launch what we call offensive strike missiles, medium range, intermediate range ballistic missiles, okay? And guess what? They're only 9 or 10 minutes away from obliterating not only Moscow, but some of our ICBM sites. 9 or 10 minutes. And this is the point. If the Americans finally get hypersonic missiles, for the layman, some of you are as old as I, you know what Mach was, right? Mach, the speed of sound. My God. Oh, the speed of sound. Would you believe Mach 9? 9 times the speed of sound. These hypersonic missiles cannot be defended against. And what Putin is telling his military, as if they didn't know, he's reminding them on the 21st of December, look, not only is this a problem, but when the US gets hypersonic missiles, they will give them to Ukraine. Whoa! The quote, the US will give hypersonic weapons to Ukraine, period, end quote. What happens next? 9 days later, the Kremlin calls the White House, says Mr. Putin would very much like to talk to Mr. Biden right away. And there was some confusion. The White House said, well, would they just talk 2 weeks ago? What's the big rush? Please, please. Mr. Putin would like to talk to Mr. Biden like today. On the 30th of December, they had this conversation. It's important to note that the President Biden was in Delaware. He was without his minders, without his associates, Blinken and Sullivan. So he handled the question all by himself. And what Mr. Putin clearly said was, look, we have this very, very delicate situation here. We're trying to do a new arrangement for Europe, but you have these missiles, and I had a session with my military just 9 days ago, and they said, look, we can't tolerate offensive strike missiles put in Ukraine. Now, Mr. Biden, as we start this negotiation process, and 9th and 10th of January, 10 days later, they were to begin in Geneva. As we start this, could you simply undertake not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine? And Biden said, well, apparently Biden said, sounds good to me, because the readout says, and I quote, it's right there on the chart, Washington has no intention to deploy offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. So, 30 December 2021. There was great rejoicing. New Year's Eve was never so joyous in Moscow. Ushakov was the prime advisor to Putin. He was waxing eloquent. It looked like there had been a break. It looked very much like finally the Americans were taking Russian security concerns seriously, or at least President Biden was. Next slide, please. You can see there, December 31st, 2021, okay? Now, here we have January 21st, 2022. Here is Lavrov, the foreign secretary, the foreign minister of Russia, saying what happened when he talked to U.S. Secretary of State Blinken on the 21st of January 2022. So if my math is correct, that's just 3 weeks after Biden undertook not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Blinken says to Lavrov, no, offensive strike missiles can be placed in Ukraine. Of course they can. We have that right. Maybe we could just talk about limiting the number of them. Now, much later, at an interview, Lavrov commented, I don't know what else you need. What else needs to be explained here? Why a special military operation, so-called, became inevitable in Ukraine. Now, the next factoid is, again, it happened, it's documented. Putin went to Beijing on the 4th of February, 2022. Now, it's very important to know that this Vertrauensbruch, this double cross, was well known to the Russians at least, 21 for at least 2 weeks before Putin went to talk with Comrade Xi Jinping. And he briefed him on this. And we know later that Xi Jinping said, well, we Chinese we don't like to violate the treaty principles of Westphalia, but this is a core interest of yours. And sometimes a country has to do what it has to do to defend those core interests. Now, we don't have any transcript of Xi Jinping telling Putin that, but Chinese support for the special military operation was as clear as when Putin left Beijing. Was it a surprise? It sure was. All my American specialists on China thought that China would never, ever would never, ever, as I would say, give Putin a waiver on Westphalia. But he did, folks. And the US administration was very, very slow in waking up to the fact that there was Russia and China joined at the hip now, 2 against 1. Now, we're talking about February 4th, 2000. Here's the next one, okay? Now, so on the 4th, on the 4th, Putin and Xi talked. What we have 8 days later, on the February 12th, this was the last talk, probably the really last talk, between Biden and Putin. And the readout said, again, Ushakov and the Russians saying, this is what happened. The US gave no meaningful response on those 2 key issues, deployment of strike weapon systems in Ukraine or on NATO expansion. Now, we're into February now. February 12th is 2 weeks before the special military operation begins. What happens on February 16th? Well, there was an exponential increase in Ukrainian army shelling of the Russian-speaking parts of Donbass. Now, there is an organization that monitors this. There is an organization that has people on the ground, inspectors. May we have the next slide, please? This organization is the OSCE. It's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, set up decades earlier in Helsinki. Now, this is what was happening in Donbass in February of 2022 before the special military operation. These figures, this bar graph, is from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a nonpartisan bunch that had inspectors on the ground. I would refer you simply to, what is that? The 14th of February, there were 500 such shellings, okay? Whoa, how about on the 18th of February? Well, looks like there were 1,400, okay? And it looks like on the 21st and the 22nd, there were similar amount of uptick in the shellings. Now, the shellings of civilian areas in Donbass, okay, the vast majority of targets were civilians. And so this is what the Russians were observing on the ground. And we also had clearly observing by everyone with a satellite that the bulk of Ukrainian army is massed near Donbass. Look at that first sentence on this chart. That's what we were looking at then, and that's the uptick in shelling. So this is what happened before the special military operation. And maybe we have the next slide, please. Okay, so right before launching this operation, Putin is talking about a blitzkrieg against the 4 million Russian speakers in Donbass. What happens is, because Putin, he's trained as a lawyer, folks, he likes to observe the letter of the law. And so the next thing you know, the Donbass regions of Lugansk and Donetsk declare their independence. They ask for defense treaties with Russia to defend themselves. And then on the 23rd of February, Lugansk and Donetsk invoke the treaties and they ask for help. On the 24th, as Putin announces the invasion of the special military operation, he invokes Article 51 of the UN Charter, and then he sends the troops in. I wanted to make one other comment here, and that had to do with China. But it escapes me right now. Perhaps it will come back to me. Let's go to the next chart, the next slide. Whoa! Now, why the big deal? Could we go back one, please? Yeah. Why the big deal about offensive strike missiles? Well, these missiles are medium range, intermediate range ballistic missiles. I told you, and I hope that you are already aware, that the US has deployed capsules for missiles that can accommodate these things in Romania years ago, and more recently, a couple of years ago, in Poland. Now, on that map, you can see where that deployment is located in Romania. You can see the one in Poland. Those are the top and the bottom arrows. And you can see the distance that it would take a generic ballistic missile to get from Poland and Romania in those sites already in place. What we got? 10 minutes, 9 minutes, average of 10 minutes. Were these offensive strike missiles to be in place near Kiev, let's say, well, that would reduce it to 7 minutes. Now, this is what the Russians are looking at even now. Now, the thing is that unlike Cuba, unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis 62 years ago in 1962, the Russians cannot be sure what's in the capsules in those missile sites in Romania and Poland. Why can they not be sure? Because the capsules can accommodate not only anti-ballistic missiles, but anti-submarine missiles, uh, anti, well, hypersonic offensive missiles, and cruise missiles. Okay. Why can't they tell what's in those capsules? Because if I haven't already mentioned it, pretty simple. Capsules have caps on them and they can't be sure what's in there. Okay. Now, the analogy I would draw here is to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the United States faced a similar threat from the then Soviet Union. We can see now from what exists in Poland and Romania and what Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, has insisted is the right of the United States to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine as well. We can see how the Kremlin, how Putin, how his generals and admirals will be looking in this situation, because if you reduce the warning time to what already exists for a generic ballistic missile, 10 minutes from Poland or Romania, how about hypersonic missiles? What happens, as Putin warned, when the US finally gets hypersonic missiles and puts them in those capsules, and we can't tell whether they're hypersonic missiles or whether they're cruise missiles or whether they're anti-ship missiles. Okay, so put yourself now. I have to explain here. I've been at this for a long time. Perhaps you can tell. Would you believe half a century? And I've always had the job of putting myself in the shoes of Soviet or Russian leaders. That's what you have to do to advise your government to make sensible decisions and to alert them to how the opponent feels about moves that the United States has done. In this case, the missile employments in Romania and Poland, and the danger, once again, of them going into Ukraine. Now, when I mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, I have a slide on that too. If you could remember this one and then take a look at the next slide, I think it will be instructive in terms of what Americans were looking at back in 1962. We could have the next slide, please. I would preface these remarks by saying I was a second lieutenant with the United States Army in 1962. I was in the southern part of the United States. I was there for this. I was scared out of my wits. We didn't know whether we'd all exist very long. Okay, let's take a look at this map here. Now, this is an accurate map representing the threat that the United States, and specifically President Kennedy, perceived from the Soviet Union. Just to backtrack for a second, Khrushchev was advised by his military that this fellow Kennedy was sort of weak, and we could really steal a march. We could really get a big advantage on the US if we put offensive strike missiles in Cuba. And Castro would love it, because then the U.S. would never invade Cuba as it had attempted to do a couple of years, 1 year before. So Khrushchev said, "Well, what will Kennedy do?" Well, we think he's a weakling. He probably won't do anything. But so Khrushchev says, "Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained," and the Russians successfully, secretly put offensive strike missiles in Cuba. Now, they also put some nuclear-capable bombers in Cuba, and they did this all before U.S. intelligence was aware of the fact, and they were there in place with nuclear warheads before John Kennedy was ever told about it. That had to do with the weather and the availability of reconnaissance aircraft and all, but that was the fact. Okay, so they tell John Kennedy, whoops, look at that small circle in the middle. Those are the sites, mostly in Florida, that these bombers that the Soviets now have in Cuba, that they could reach. Not much of a threat, but you've lived in Savannah or Florida, Savannah being a major naval port, of course, that's a real threat. Now, the real threat, Mr. President, comes from SS-4s. Now, SS-4s already in place in Cuba. And how, Mr. President, do we know that they're SS-4s? Mr. President, this one's easy, okay? It's as though they put a sign out there for our reconnaissance aircraft to read, please be aware, this is an SS-4 medium range or intermediate range ballistic missiles with this kind of a range, the second circle, okay? All the way up almost to Washington, Norfolk, Savannah, almost to Omaha. So the president says, my God, how do you know? And they said, look, Mr. President, we know the signature. That's the imagery analyst's word for this. Each SS-4 site has a signature, and we know exactly where the warheads are. And so it's as though they're advertising SS-4s when they put the exact same configuration, the exact same signature in Cuba. They don't care if we know or not. It's a fait accompli. They can hit us and hit us big. So what does President Kennedy do? Well, he takes this very seriously. Why? Because it's a core interest, okay? A core interest of the United States not to be under the threat of something that takes 9 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, to get to Washington or the places on the Eastern Seaboard. Existential threat. Well, I used that word before with respect to how Putin looks at the existential threat from coming from Romanian and Poland sites. Now, back in the day, and as I say, I was there in 1962. The pundits and all the wise people never ever said to President Kennedy, wait a second, Mr. President. Fidel Castro has every right to join in any alliance that he wants to join. I mean, you can't deny him that. He's asked for these missiles. He has a right to choose his allies and have them. Nobody said that. Why? Because it was a core interest, and everyone supported Kennedy and recognized this as an existential threat. So what did he do? He put in a blockade. Now, to soften the blow, since blockades are illegal under international law, he called it a quarantine. Okay, a quarantine, okay? It's still a blockade, folks, all right? Is a blockade illegal? Yes, as I just said, it's illegal. He did it anyway. Why? Because he wanted to prevent any more missiles from coming into Cuba. Now, if you look at that bottom quadrant there on the left, you'll see those blue ships. Those are the ships, the warships that President Kennedy ordered to enforce this blockade. Was it successful? Well, partially, because note that great big circle. Those are for the SS-5s, okay? They had much greater range. What is the range here? Oh, you can see 2,200. So you can see this range here, and that's what these ships were. See those red ships? The red ships are the red communists. The red ships had SS-5s on them. So to a degree, the blockade worked. Now, in those days, there were communications between high-level US and Soviet officials. It was by teletype. I was around then my friend Jack Matlock, who later became ambassador to the Soviet Union. He was in Embassy Moscow translating what Khrushchev was saying and what Kennedy was saying. And in short, Khrushchev came to his senses and said, "Wow, what we just did is an existential threat to America. I didn't know that Kennedy would be strong rather than weak. I didn't know they would consider it a core interest and put in a blockade illegal and threaten nuclear war, also illegal under the UN Charter, but he did. So Khrushchev to his military, I guess this one didn't work. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. This is not an existential threat to the Soviet Union. Let's get out of Dodge. Let's withdraw these troops. Let's withdraw these missiles before something really bad happens. But Castro doesn't want you to withdraw them. Tell Castro, forget about it. We went too far. We're withdrawing those missiles, and they did. Now there was a side agreement that needs to be mentioned here. Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother, talked to Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador in Washington, and said, "Look, we know that Khrushchev has his military leaders looking down, breathing down his neck, and we know they're saying, 'You're going to just withdraw here? What are you going? Aren't you going to extract some sort of promise?'" And finally, Bobby checked with John Kennedy, said, "Yes, okay, we will promise to withdraw our equivalent offensive strike missiles from Turkey, but we don't want that to be part of the overt agreement. We want an agreement that says to the public, in return for Khrushchev returning these missiles, we decide that we'll not invade Cuba. That's the deal. Now, on the side, we also agree to pull out those missiles in Turkey. Now, there was a degree of trust in those days. Khrushchev went to his military and said, "Well, they're going to pull these missiles out of Turkey." And the military said, "You trust them?" And Khrushchev said, "Yeah." Now, was he trustworthy? He was. There was no double cross here. After 4 or 5 months, Kennedy very non-publicly withdrew those missiles from Turkey. So what I'm saying here is that the story that's not been told very well in terms of this issue is that Putin at the end of December and beginning of January and February 2021, 2022, faced exactly this kind of threat, a core interest, an existential threat, as Kennedy did back in 1962. Now, Khrushchev had the wisdom to recognize that his stakes were not as deep, that his interests were not going to be affected if he withdrew. Sure, it's a bloody nose, but they would recover. The question, of course, is whether what will happen in Ukraine, because the same sort of existential threat is perceived by Russia, and there doesn't seem to be any indication on the part of the United States to even talk about these offensive strike missiles. Witness Vertrauensbruch, the Vertrauensbruch, the double cross that happened between the time when President Biden, all alone, probably feeling pretty good at the end of the year, and say, "All right, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, we won't put any offensive strike missiles in Ukraine," and then being undermined, being deceived, going ahead with that is Blinken and Sullivan countermanding this, telling Lavrov and Putin, forget about it. That, hey, we're talking now for the president. We're going to keep those missiles in there. Now, this is one aspect that has not been addressed adequately, in my view, and that's why I dwelled on this to such an extent. I'll just add a couple other things here, and I don't want to infringe upon our time for the Q&A. There are
Mhm.
these questions. You can withdraw that slide right now if you would. There are these, oh yeah, well, let me just finish with this. I forgot we had this final slide. There were people, realist school of political science, international relations, who got it right. And back in September 2014, okay, so this is 3 months, a couple of months after the coup, the Western sponsored coup in Ukraine. And what Mearsheimer wrote in the prestigious Journal of Foreign Affairs, look, US and NATO face a choice now on Ukraine. They can exacerbate, make worse hostilities with Russia, and devastate and devastate. Think of the mothers of those 500,000 Ukrainian youth that have perished on the battlefield. Think of how Ukraine looks now from the air. Devastate Ukraine, or we can work to create a prosperous but neutral Ukraine. Okay. Now, in May of 2023, after the special military operation started, Putin, Mearsheimer said, look, we know from the record, from the written record and the testimony of the players, that Putin invaded Ukraine with great reluctance. I don't think he had any options from a realpolitik point of view. He was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement so that he would not have to invade. And as most of you know, the French and the Germans played fast and loose with their promise to work out the Minsk agreement in such a way that the Donbass people who speak Russian would have a degree of autonomy in Ukraine. Both Merkel and Hollande, who were in power at the time, bragged about how this was just a deception to give Ukraine enough time to build up its army under US NATO tutelage and with US NATO weaponry. Now, last thing I'll say here is that we see there that Mearsheimer was saying, well, look, we could create a prosperous but neutral Ukraine. That was the rub. Now, people say, well, neutrality. Did the Russians agree to an agreement that would have a ceasefire and neutrality for Ukraine? Yes, they did. When was that? That was in April 2022. With whom did they agree? With the Ukrainians. The top negotiator has all admitted all this. Long story short, that fell apart when the UK and the US said, no, you should not do this. We want to continue this war. We'll give you the weaponry, not only to win, but also to defeat and weaken Russia. Now, where do I get all that? It was in Ukrainskaya Pravda in April of 2022, for God's sake. Now it's very clear with these testimonies. But so, what am I saying here? The teaching point is this: Putin will never stop. He won't stop with Ukraine. He'll go west and he'll be on the English. Well, folks, please listen. Putin already stopped. He stopped in April 2022, 6 weeks after the special military operation began. And so the proof is in the pudding. Will Putin stop? Well, he already did once. Would he stop again for the right kind of neutrality for Ukraine? Of course he would. So the question is, will the West decide to negotiate? And the last point here, it's a point that's so simple, Why is it that the West, the collective West and NATO, are out of ammunition? I mean, 155 millimeter shells have been basic since I served in the US Army in 1962, for God's sake. 155mm shells. We ran out of them. Europe ran out of them. Why could we possibly have run out of them? Guess what, folks? Because before we overthrew the government in Ukraine, everyone assumed there was no threat from Russia. Matter of fact, President Bush and Cheney even said, there's no threat from Russia. There's no threat from China. We can work these things out. They're developing. Oh, so up until the coup in Kiev, that was the attitude. So why do you build all these shells? Why do you build all this artillery? You don't have to, and so you don't. So 2 points that I leave you with. Putin already stopped, okay, back in April of 2022. And the reason that the collective West is out of shells, out of other ammunition as well, is because Russia was not perceived as a threat and only became perceived as a threat lately when we wanted to build up our offensive strike capability. And I'll leave it at that because I see time is wasting here. And I hope that, well, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to trying to answer whatever questions you have at this point.
Yeah. So Ray, just stay with us. So who has a question? The moment, Ray will be right with you.
Okay.
Yeah. Just okay.
Oh, Ray, thank you very much for an excellent expose. It was really very interesting to see it from an insider's point of view. Now, I have two questions. First one, very quick one. The first one is, did eventually the US already place these ballistic missiles in Kiev? And the second one is one that I've already asked before. Someone, during the recent SPIEF meeting in St. Petersburg, a journalist asked Putin, what would it take to get a peace agreement? And he mentioned Minsk, and he mentioned also Istanbul. And Putin said Istanbul will be a good start, but we would have to add some additional conditions to it. He didn't mention what conditions that would be, but maybe you can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yes, well, these are good questions. I've made some notes here. Oh, yes. The first question was whether offensive strike missiles are likely to be in place in Ukraine. It is very hard to predict what the leaders, so-called around Biden, would advise. They are not completely logical people, and they have a lot to lose if the war in Ukraine is lost, if the US election is lost, and if they in turn lose their freedom by going to jail. I say that advisedly because there are court testimony and documents of all kinds that implicate not only Hunter Biden, but bribery on the part of his father, Blinken, and Sullivan as well are vulnerable. So they have a personal stake in this. So what I say now is vernünftig, okay? It has not to do with what they decide. If you sei doch vernünftig, okay, be reasonable. Would they try to put the kinds of missile emplacements in Ukraine after the history that I just ran down? Well, anyone in their sane mind would not. And that's why I had mentioned that these people are quite not so sane sometimes. So what would happen if they did try to do this? They would be observed immediately, and they would be shot up. They would be destroyed. So that's one reason I think they may refrain from doing that. With respect to the second question, you point out very well that Putin himself at St. Petersburg referred to the Istanbul Accords. Now, the Istanbul, that's what I was referring to before, April 2022. Neutrality for Ukraine, a ceasefire, and an agreement to treat such other issues as necessary, to include Crimea, later. Okay. Now, would Putin be willing to settle for that now? He made it very clear, as you point out in your question. No. Now the situation has changed markedly. We have new provinces of Russia itself. We're not going to give those up. We have to take into account the lay of the land on the ground. The Russians are all but smelling victory in Ukraine. They will be much harder bargainers. What they will insist on, and what Putin has said himself, is a cordon sanitaire, okay, a buffer zone that would exist to prevent people in Ukraine or NATO forces to shoot missiles more than 200, 300 miles into Russia or the Russian speaking provinces. So, yeah, that's a good question. I hope I've answered it. I don't want to take too much more time. There may be other questions.
You did. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Ray.
Hello, Ray. This is Onek. I have thank you that you are here and that it worked technically wonderful. My question is, how can we stop NATO to exist?
How can we what?
How can we stop NATO to exist? NATO
All right, the last word, how can we stop NATO?
to exist. We should stop. We should abolish. We should abolish NATO. How can we abolish NATO?
Oh, abolish NATO. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, NATO should have been abolished when the Soviet Union fell apart. As a matter of fact, I would remind people in America, even I was taught originally that NATO was constructed to face down the Warsaw Pact, okay? The Russians had assembled Eastern Europe and there was a military threat, and so NATO was designed to meet that military threat. Folks, guess what? NATO came first. NATO was formed years, I think it was 6 years or so before the Warsaw Pact was formed. So why was NATO formed? Well, this little reminder here, Lord somebody, Ismay from Britain, who was the first Secretary General, said, well, NATO was formed to keep the Americans in Europe, to keep the Russians out of Europe, and to keep the Germans down. Whoa. Well, that worked until the Soviet Union imploded. And then some Western politicians thought it would be good to try to keep the Russians down and let the Germans rise up again. And so the Russians are no longer down. And the NATO is very labile right now. And if things work out as I think they will over the next year, NATO will become even less a paper tiger than they are now. Now they have nuclear weapons and they have some disturbed people in charge. So that's the caveat. But on the ground, NATO is no match for what it faces now. And that's the way things have evolved. I'll stop there.
Any other questions? Do we have? Okay, right there, Alexander. You. Just a moment, Ray. Just a moment. Do you want to come? I don't think he can hear you over there. So you can try. Just a moment.
Sure.
Alexander. My name is Alexander Peske. It's a pleasure to hear you. The question is, if the conflict freeze or ended with not so lucky end for a western part of Europe. How do you think? It could be a turning point for European Union or NATO on Europe ground. I believe after this conflict, after this war, NATO and EU will be changed in their form and team.
If I understood the question correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong or don't answer it correctly, NATO is populated by people who need jobs and, in my view, political hacks who are so subservient to the United States that it is, for me, as an American citizen, embarrassing. Okay. Now, I spent a lot of time in Germany as a U.S. official, and that was back in the 60s and the 70s. I kept asking myself, hey, the war is over. How long will it take for the Germans to act like adults? Okay. You can understand them acting like children right after the war, but when are they going to grow up? Well, I don't know the answer to that these 30 years later. It seems that it's nikagda, never. I mean, here are the Germans acquiescing in the United States blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. My God, here's Scholz sitting there with, I'm not sitting, standing there with Biden when Biden announces that pipeline will be not anymore. Did Biden tell Scholz what the plans were? Well, whether he did or he didn't, the Germans have acquiesced and chosen to blame some of the folks. The Swedes, the Danes, oh, they've done their investigations, but they can't figure it out. Give me a break. So I cite that simply as the epitome of the slavishness with which the political hacks who now run Europe bow to the United States. Now, depending on how this election goes in the United States in November, things could change appreciably. But until now, you can expect the people advising Biden to keep on keeping on for as long as they can. The question is, with respect to Ukraine, whether Mr. Putin and his advisors will say, well, let's just keep attrition here, attrition, and let's not give Ukraine a total defeat before the election, lest Biden and company decide to do something really drastic. Sorry for that long comment. I hope I covered your question, but if not, let me know.
Very good. Very good. Ray, you've done well. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Let me just finish with my initial quote, if I'm still on air.
You are.
The Bundestag in Germany has a very courageous Abgeordnete named Savim Dagdalen. And it was she that I quoted in the beginning, and I would like to leave you with this quote, especially for those who may have questions about what I said, whether it's really based on fact or whether I'm making it up. And what she said again was this: Es ist unsere erste Pflicht, sich bei diesem Königreich der Lügen nicht dumm machen zu lassen. End quote. Let's let's not let ourselves be doomed. Let's educate our fellow countrymen and the rest of Europe that it doesn't have to be this way 80 years after World War II. Thank you very much for listening. I wish you all luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Um 18:45 wird es weitergehen. 18:45.